advances?
So I think that's a really good point, and I think that one of the, just to give folks the context of the White House and a little bit of our setup, is I work for the Domestic Policy Council at the White House that focuses on all issues ranging from education to immigration to justice and regulatory, urban affairs, the list goes on. We have our National Security Council that focuses on international and foreign policy, our National Economic Council, which we work closely with, that focuses on economic issues. My office within the Domestic Policy Council focuses on policy that advances upward social mobility and economic opportunity for all Americans, trying to strengthen the middle class and grow the middle class, helping low-income families reach that middle class. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of work that happens within that mobility and opportunity perspective that's really important to women. And so we work very closely with the Council on Women and Girls, which was actually created by this president in 2009 to enhance, support, and coordinate the efforts of existing programs for women and girls throughout the federal government. And the Council on Women and Girls is actually the group, the office within the White House that commissioned this report on women in America. And I think one of the reasons for commissioning this report, one, there had not been a federal government report focused solely on women, really culling all of the data with regards to women since 1963. So to say it was overdue is somewhat of an understatement. And I think that Valerie Jarrett, who is a senior advisor to the president, but also the chairperson of the Council of Women and Girls, really felt that by doing this report, it would help us see where we're coming from, see the advances we've made, but also be a guidepost for policy moving forward. And one of the things that the president has said time and time again, and we really truly believe, and is part of our philosophy at the White House, is that a lot of the issues that we quote unquote call women's issues are not just women's issues. They affect the entire family, they affect America. We are half of this country, so we are half of the workforce. And so as we talk about issues that are quote unquote women's issues, we really see it as American issues. And we really felt that by doing this report, we would be able to highlight some of the advances we've made, but also see where there are gaps and where we should be really focusing advancing policy.
And you took U.S. Census data and then looked at 5 primary areas.
We did. So, we used the Department of Commerce and the Office of Management Budget. I know some of the ladies up here are the authors of the report. I am not, as a disclaimer, the author of our report. But we did commission it at the White House and use our statisticians and our experts and researchers to put together this report. And we focused on 5 areas that we thought were really important to women's issues. The first being people, families, and income. Second, education. Third, employment. Fourth, health. And 5, crime and violence. And as I was going through this report, we put out this report in March of 2011. And as I was going back through this report, preparing for this conference, it was amazing to see so many of the parallels between the research that we have done in this report and policies and accomplishments that we have actually advanced over the last 2.5 years. I look at education, and there is data within the report showing the underrepresentation of women in the STEM fields, which is something that is so important to the president to, one, be just pushing and advancing science, technology, engineering, and math fields generally for all Americans. If we're going to be a global competitor, we need to be number one in those areas, but also trying to address the underrepresentation of women in the STEM fields as well. And there's a lot of work that the Council of Women and Girls and our Office of Science and Technology Policy has done. And we still have a lot of work to do in the STEM field. And my colleagues at the Domestic Policy Council and the Education Office work very closely on this. But I do have to say, I was somewhat hopeful very recently when the Google Science Fair, the most recent Google Science Fair winners, came to the Oval Office to meet the president. This is an international competition, and all 3 of the winners, the first, second, and third place winners, were all American, and they were all girls. Now,
14 to 17.
Yeah, 14 to 17.
Unbelievably impressive.
So we still have a lot of work to do in, advancing STEM policy and making sure that there is enough women representation in STEM policy. But that gave us, at least at the White House, a little bit of hope. Now, I will say they explained to us their projects. They were a little bit more advanced than my volcano project from middle school and high school days, but that's what we need. So I think that we've seen, and we can, I can go through each of the 5 pillars within the Women in America report. I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on healthcare reform. The report really shows some of the data and the women who have been uninsured and not having access to healthcare. And as Linda mentioned I used to work on healthcare reform, both on Capitol Hill when we were doing the bill, as well as implementation at the White House when I first came to the White House. And it is a historic piece of legislation and has such great benefits for all Americans, but specifically for women when you look at the preventive health services that women will no longer have to pay for come 2014. One stat that I remember hearing a few years back as we started looking at health reform is that in the individual marketplace currently for health insurance, a 25-year-old woman pays up to 250% more than their male counterpart for just being a woman. And so, the discrimination that happens in the individual market with health insurance because of basically just due to gender, will be eliminated also under this health care bill. And the list goes on with regards to those pieces. I mean, providing reasonable break times and places for women in the workplace to express breast milk in the first year of their child's life for women who choose to breastfeed, sounds small, but is critical when you're that woman, right? And so, I think that one of the things that we did with the Affordable Care Act is, yes, it's going to provide health insurance for all Americans, but there are many specific pieces that really focus on women's issues as well.
Raquel, those are very good examples of where policy implications, or at least policy that existed, has already changed the numbers that are now showing up in the data. But can I just ask you, and the areas, by the way, that they looked at were families and income, as you mentioned, education, as you mentioned, employment, health, as Raquel described, and crime and violence. Could you just touch briefly on employment and crime and violence?
Sure. So in the employment side, we have made so many advances in this country when it comes to women in the workplace. We are nearly, as I alluded to earlier, 50% of the workforce. And I think some folks had already mentioned the statistic that more women are actually in higher education, both college and graduate education here in America. But one of the things that we still haven't fully completed is around equal pay. And as you can imagine, as women become more within the workforce, we are also more of the breadwinners in American families. And so as we talk about equal pay issues, it's, this is one of those issues where I really don't feel like it's, it's a women's issue. This is an American issue. For that woman who has a pay disparity, it's affecting the entire family's bottom line. It's affecting their husbands, their sons, their daughters. And the president has been really focused with regards to equal pay and trying to close that pay gap. The first bill he actually signed, and Linda actually alluded to this as well, but the first bill that he actually signed as President of the United States was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. And this law is something that was so critical. As many of you know the story of Lilly Ledbetter, right before she was retiring, she realized that there was this huge pay disparity that she was not aware of from her employment through her employer, but the statute of limitations had already expired and she had no recourse. And so this law restores the basic protections against pay discrimination. But we also recognize that as important as the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act is, that more needs to be done. And it's one of the reasons why we continue to urge, and the president continues to urge, Congress to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act, which was also something that has been deliberated, has actually come up for a vote in the Senate and failed by a very slim margin. But the Paycheck Fairness Act is so critical because part of why Lilly's statute of limitations expired is because she didn't know. Knowledge is power. And unless you know about the pay disparity that is happening in your workplace, there's nothing you can do about it. And so the Paycheck Fairness Act would really give women more power to stop pay discrimination generally. And if I can talk, when you talk about employment and the workplace and the work that we do at the Mobility and Opportunity Office within Domestic Policy Council, we recognize that small business is the backbone of this country. And one of the things that the president has really focused on within small business is SBA lending. And SBA lending is 3 to 5 times more likely to provide loans to minority-owned and women-owned businesses than private banks. And so we think it's really important to really focus on that as we try to advance women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses. And as part of that, the president has actually expanded SBA lending. Between 2009 and September 2011, more than $7 billion was made available through 29,000 SBA loans to women-owned businesses. And you mentioned, Pat, about violence and crime. This is not an issue that I cover personally, but I'm a strong believer that when you're talking about domestic violence and violence against women, it is inextricably linked and tied to economic security and economic opportunity, which is what I do work on. But Lynn Rosenthal, which many of you may know, is our resident expert at the White House on these issues and works in the Vice President's office. And quite frankly, the Vice President has been a long time champion and supporter of these issues. And you know, while women are less likely than in the past, as the Women in America report shows, to be targets of violent crimes, women are more likely than men to be victims of certain crimes such as stalking and domestic violence. And so we have a lot of work that we do really focusing on that. And just a couple pieces that I want to mention that I think, you know, do tie back to the economic security angle that I work on. The Department of Housing and Urban Development actually recently released new rules that provide protections to victims living in subsidized housing and public housing to ensure that victims do not lose their housing due to crimes committed against them. This may seem commonsensical, but the way that the public housing system currently works, that many victims of domestic violence, because a crime took place in their residence and crimes cannot take place in public housing units, would be evicted or thrown out of public housing. So this is, you know, ties back to, again, the economic opportunity and making sure that we're preventing homelessness against for these women, for these female victims as well. And then the last piece that I think is so huge and is really a game changer. Last year, the administration introduced comprehensive measures to help schools and colleges and universities better understand their obligations under federal civil rights law, like Title IX, to prevent and respond to the problems of campus sexual assaults. And as many of you know, Title IX prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex and education programs and activities, but the new guidance that we put out last year notes that discrimination can also include sexual violence, such as rape, sexual assault, sexual battery, and sexual coercion. And we know some of the issues that we do have in trying to fight these issues is creating a pathway. And so by this guidance, you know, now universities and colleges have a pathway through Title IX to really protect these young girls in their college campuses.
Well, Raquel, you may not have been the author of the report, but you know it pretty well. And I did ask you for a lot there to go into all 5 of those areas, but largely because I think this report points out, especially for those of us who live in this country, you know, we can see where policy has made the difference, where there has been progress, and we still see the gaps.
Yeah.
And one of the gaps that's most significant that I'm sure we'll come back to again is, yes, there are more women working, but they're still making less for it. And there's still all the other implications that are mentioned in other areas of the report. And it is important in these reports to look at the gaps, because the gaps tell the story. And I think that's why Zadia Zahidi, as the head of constituents at the World Economic Forum, finally convinced the leaders at Davos that this was an important area in which we needed to measure some gaps, to come up with real data about how countries are doing, and to measure them on through a gender lens, measure the magnitude as well as the scope of political, economic, and educational gender-based disparities. And so the Global Gender Gap Report is out again this year. Many might have read it last year and saw that the US was number 17, I think, last year overall in the measurements. Sweden was number 1, is that right? Sweden? Iceland was number 1. Sweden was number 2 or 3, though, right? Yeah. And so it's interesting just, you know, to look at, you know, where countries measure up. But what matters in this report, it seems to me, is when you start to dive down and you see why these numbers end up and where the rankings end up as they do. So share with us what were the most surprising, perhaps, report and gaps this year, and what you feel changed between last year and this year's Global